Dawn came slow over the high mesas, the kind of pale gold light that turns dust to ribbon and canyon wall to cathedral. The desert was holding its breath, the way it does before heat takes command, and only the wind made a sound, threading through sage and brittle grass like a whisper that had learned to travel alone. A single horse picked its way along a narrow ridge, hooves careful on shale, ears flicking at the hush. In the saddle rode a man people in 3 towns, simply called the Single Cowboy, because no one ever saw him with a brand to his name or a partner to his shadow. He carried the quiet like a second hat, brim pulled low against what the world had already taken. Before we ride further, if stories of courage and mercy speak to you, tip your hat to the trail. Leave a like and tell your town in the comments. It helps this campfire burn brighter. His coat bore the kind of dust that never washes out, the color of roads that don't end, and the leather creaked in time with the horse's breathing. He rode without hurry, the way men do who know that distance is a teacher and silence a friend. In his saddlebags lay a coil of rope, a canteen dented at the lip, and a Bible with a broken spine, pages thin as onion skin and marked by thumb and weather. He didn't look back. Men who live by the straightness of their own word don't keep their heads turned to yesterday. Below the ridge, the land fell away into a canyon that looked carved by a patient God. Cottonwoods gathered low where a thin river stitched shadows together, and farther on, the cliff ran out into a jut of stone like a ship's prow, suspended over emptiness. The place had a history of bad decisions, boot tracks that began strong and ended in air, bottles that had told men they could fly. When the wind hit that jut, it came up in a sudden gasp, as though the canyon had memories of names it once tried to hold. The cowboy pulled his reins and let the horse settle. He had felt it before he heard it, the way birds will lift in a frantic bloom from some invisible edge, the way the wind changes its story. Somewhere ahead, a cry had been cut short. Not the bark of a coyote, not the wild, broken call of a calf. Human, thin as a thread and pulled too tight. He eased from the saddle, boots planting soft, and walked the ridge with a hand to the horse's cheek to steady her. There was no dust plume of pursuit, no gunshot to borrow meaning from, just that shocked quiet a land uses when it wants you to listen properly. As he neared the stone prow, he saw it, the color first, a strip of blue against red rock, a dress clinging where it shouldn't be, and the trembling of fingers that had run past their strength. She was hanging right on the lip, a woman whose weight had tipped her over the edge, so that her toes, then her boots, then her breath had lost purchase. One hand locked to a root that had burst from the cliff face like a stubborn vein, the other clawed at dust that wouldn't hold. The wind lifted her hair in black sheets and then dropped it, and when she glanced up, the cowboy saw a pair of eyes fixed not on him, but on something farther, older, like she had already visited the place where a person says goodbye. "Ma'am," he said, voice even as if greeting a neighbor at a fence. He went to his knees, belly to the rock, and felt the heat that had already begun to pool there, as if the day had waited for this moment to turn fierce. The root tore a fraction under her grip, a soft, dry sound his bones disliked. He reached his left hand forward, palm wide, fingers steady. The wind pushed against his hat and tried to claim it, but the stampede string held. "Don't look down. Look at me." She looked finally, and for a heartbeat something crowded his chest. Familiarity shaped like a knock at a long, closed door. Her face was dusted and blood-dark at the knuckles, but there was a line of recognition that ran from her gaze to a buried corner of his memory, a line as taut as the root she clung to. He didn't know her name. He knew something else. He knew the ache of her eyes. The horse snorted behind him. The canyon breathed in. The root groaned again. He shifted closer, belly scraping rock, and set his right arm like a wedge against a notch. "On my count," he murmured. "You're not falling today." The words were simple, but in that place, with that wind and that drop, they felt like an oath spoken into the registry of the earth. Somewhere, far off, a hawk cut a clean arc through the morning, and the land waited to see if promises still meant anything. Before that morning, his days had followed the same quiet rhythm, one that asked for nothing and gave even less. The cowboy would wake before the sun rose over the canyons, pour black coffee that tasted of tin and smoke, and let the silence fill whatever the world no longer did. He had no homestead, no letter waiting in any post office, and no name carved into a headstone worth visiting. His home was the trail, and the trail had no mercy, only miles. He used to think that maybe God had stopped talking to men like him, men who had lost too many good things to the same bad choices. But even in the hush of those lonely mornings, he still felt something, a pulse under the dust, a whisper between the wind and the creak of saddle leather, like a promise he couldn't quite forget. When he rode through towns, people would nod, but not ask. They saw the look of a man who'd left something behind, someone behind. The blacksmith in Santa Rosa once said, "That fella rides like he's got ghosts following him." Maybe he did. Because every time he crossed a river, he found himself looking down at the reflection of a woman he couldn't name, but couldn't erase either. He remembered only fragments, a laugh in the rain, a blue ribbon caught on a nail, a goodbye spoken too soon. The memory came to him like dust, always there, impossible to hold. At night he'd set up camp near a dry arroyo, feed the horse, then sit by the fire with that broken, spined Bible, not to read it, but to touch it. To remember that once upon a time he'd believed justice meant something more than bullets and graves. He would trace the thin paper, whispering words he hadn't said out loud in years. "Deliver me from evil." And sometimes, in the rustle of leaves, he thought he heard an answer. That morning, when he found the woman hanging on the cliff's edge, it wasn't just a stranger he saw. It was the ghost of every wrong choice he'd ever made staring back at him. The same ribbon of blue. The same frightened eyes. The past had finally taken shape, and it was dangling between heaven and hell. He didn't know whether saving her would redeem him or ruin him. But for the first time in years, something inside him moved. And that was enough to make him reach again, harder this time, ready to trade his life for one last chance at doing right. The canyon seemed to hold its breath, the wind circling like a prayer unfinished. Somewhere deep down, he realized this wasn't coincidence. The West doesn't hand out coincidences, it hands out reckonings. The rock beneath his chest trembled, just a heartbeat, just enough to remind him that seconds in the desert don't last forever. The woman's fingers slipped half an inch, nails scraping stone, and her cry tore through the canyon like a gunshot that never found an echo. "Hold on!" he shouted, though the wind carried the words away before they reached her ears. He braced his boots against a crack in the rock, reached farther. His fingertips brushed hers, but dust exploded between them. And she dropped again, the root groaning, bending under the pull of her weight. The horse behind him neighed, hooves shifting nervously. The cowboy's heart pounded hard enough that it filled the silence around them. He looked once at the sky, then back at her face, and for an instant, under the panic, he saw it again. Recognition, something deeper than memory. Like two lives had once shared the same prayer. He ripped off his lasso, looped it fast, and anchored the other end around a jutting stone. "You don't let go, you hear?" he said, voice steady, though sweat rolled from his neck. "I'm coming down." He tested the rope, then began lowering himself inch by inch toward her. The cliff wall was rough, biting his palms. The air grew hotter, thinner, and the wind tugged at him like invisible hands, trying to rewrite fate. She tried to speak, something between a sob and a word, but her lips barely formed the sound. Then he heard it. Voices below, men's voices. Laughter, cold, sharp, wrong, the kind that doesn't belong to rescue. He froze. The sound rose from the canyon floor, echoing upward between the walls. The woman's eyes widened in terror, and now he understood. She hadn't fallen by accident. She'd been driven to that edge. "Who's down there?" he called out, his voice cutting through the canyon. A reply came, lazy and venomous. "Ain't your concern, cowboy. Best keep riding unless you want to join her." The cowboy's jaw tightened. He recognized the accent, dry, cruel, from the border towns where law had packed up and left. He glanced down, saw figures moving between the shadows of the rocks. 3 men, rifles glinting in the sun, circling like wolves that had already tasted blood. The woman gasped, her grip slipping again. He made a choice then, not one of reason, but of something older and truer. He slid another foot down, ignoring the rope burn, ignoring the way the cliff crumbled under his boots. His hand closed around her wrist just as the root tore free, sending stones and dust raining into the abyss. For a moment they both hung suspended, her weight dragging on his arm, his boots digging into rock that wasn't meant to hold 2 souls at once. The wind screamed through the canyon, and somewhere below a man laughed again. He pulled with everything left in him. His shoulders burned, his teeth clenched, and inch by inch he dragged her upward until her hands found the ledge. She collapsed onto the stone, trembling, breath ragged and eyes wild. He climbed after her, chest heaving, and for a moment neither spoke. Only the wind did. Then she whispered, "They're coming back." And down in the canyon the men had already begun the climb. The wind had changed. It no longer sang through the canyon, it screamed. The cowboy pulled the woman back from the edge, his hands raw and bleeding, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. She lay on the rock, chest heaving, dress torn and covered in dust. Her hair clung to her face, and her eyes, those same eyes that had struck him like a forgotten prayer, were wide with something deeper than fear. It was recognition. The kind that doesn't come from seeing someone, it comes from remembering them. "Who are they?" he asked quietly, keeping his voice low. She turned her head slowly, her lips trembling. "Men from down south," she whispered. "They killed my brother. Said I saw too much. I ran." Her breath hitched. "They chased me here." The cowboy looked over the cliff's edge. The 3 men were climbing, their boots kicking loose stones, their curses rising with the dust. They were still a good 100 feet below, but they were coming fast. He could see the glint of rifles strapped across their backs, the confidence of men who believed the law was too far away to reach them. He scanned the ridge quickly. The terrain was cruel. Flat rock, no trees, nowhere to hide. Only the narrow trail leading north, winding like a scar along the canyon's spine. He turned to her. "Can you walk?" She tried, but pain shot through her ankle and she gasped, nearly collapsing again. He caught her before she fell, his arms strong around her waist. She was light, too light. "Then we ride," he said. He helped her toward his horse, tightening the saddle strap, his movements sharp and controlled. The animal snorted, sensing his urgency. Behind them a gunshot cracked. The sound ricocheted off the canyon walls, echoing in endless repetition. A bullet struck the rock beside his boot, spraying dust. The woman flinched, covering her ears. The cowboy turned his head, eyes narrowing. He wasn't a man who looked for trouble anymore, but when it found him, he faced it like a storm. He lifted her onto the horse, then swung into the saddle behind her. "Hold tight," he said. The mare reared once, then lunged forward into a gallop. The canyon blurred into streaks of red and gold as hooves struck sparks off the stone. Another shot rang out, then another. The air whistled with passing lead. The cowboy urged the horse faster, leaning low to shield the woman from the wind. She pressed against him, trembling. "They'll never stop," she whispered. He didn't answer. He knew she was right. Men like those didn't chase for bounty. They chased for silence. They reached a bend in the trail, and the land opened into a wide plain scorched by sun and silence. In the distance stood the remains of an old mission, half collapsed, the whitewashed walls crumbling, the wooden cross still standing crooked against the sky. It was a place the locals called La Sombra de Dios, the shadow of God, the kind of place where the living didn't linger, but the lost found their way. He pulled the reins. The horse slowed to a trot, then stopped. The woman looked at him, confused. "Why are we stopping?" He dismounted and scanned the horizon. The dust cloud behind them was growing. The men were close. "Because there's nowhere else to run," he said, his voice calm, as if he'd made peace with something long ago. He looked at her, his tone softening. "You'll stay behind that wall. No matter what happens, you don't move until it's quiet again. Understand?" Tears welled in her eyes. "They'll kill you." He gave a faint smile, half sorrow, half promise. "They've been trying for years." He reached into his coat, pulled out the worn Bible, and placed it in her hands. "Hold this. If anything happens to me, you take it north to Santa Rosa. There's a church there. Father Morales. He'll know what to do." The woman nodded, clutching the Bible like it was a heartbeat. Another gunshot shattered the air. The cowboy turned toward the sound, his eyes cold now, steady. The time for questions had ended. He drew his revolver, an old Colt, the metal dulled by years of use, and checked the chamber. One last look at her. Stay low. He stepped out into the open, the sun painting his shadow long across the dirt. The riders were almost upon them, 3 men, dust devils at their heels, rifles ready. The cowboy squared his shoulders, feet planted, heart still. He wasn't running anymore. The sun burned straight above, white-hot and merciless. The desert seemed to hold its breath as the 3 riders thundered closer, their silhouettes shimmering in the heat like mirages made of hate. The cowboy stood his ground in front of the ruined mission, dust swirling around his boots, revolver at his side. He'd faced death before, but never like this. Not with a woman clutching a Bible behind him and the sound of hooves echoing like war drums through his chest. The lead rider, a thick man with a scar twisting down his cheek, slowed his horse to a trot. The other 2 fanned out, rifles angled low but ready. Their faces carried that familiar look of desert cruelty, sunburned, grinning, half drunk on power. "Well, I'll be," the scarred man called out, voice lazy and poisonous. "Didn't expect to find a hero this far from town. You hand her over, cowboy, and maybe we'll let you keep breathing." The cowboy didn't move. He adjusted the brim of his hat, eyes steady on the men. "You had your chance to do right," he said quietly. "You chose wrong." One of the men laughed. "Listen to him preach." Another spat in the dust. "Ain't no law out here, friend. Just us." The cowboy's hand hovered near his revolver. The wind picked up, stirring the silence between them, and from far off, so faint it could have been memory, came the distant sound of hooves. Not 3 this time. Many. The scarred man frowned, glancing over his shoulder. The cowboy caught it. The hesitation, the shift. He tilted his head slightly, a ghost of a smile flickering beneath the shadow of his hat. "You hear that?" he said. At first it was only a murmur, a low thunder crawling up from the horizon. But then it grew, rolling like the voice of the earth itself. Dust began to rise in the distance, thick and golden, swallowing the light. The 3 outlaws turned, squinting into the glare. Over the ridge came riders, dozens of them, moving as one. Their coats flapped like black banners, sunlight flashing on polished saddles and buckles. The thunder of hooves grew until it drowned the wind, until even the canyon seemed to bow its head. The scarred man cursed under his breath. "Hell no, that can't be." But it was. The cowboy knew them by the way they rode, not for glory, but for something heavier. These were men bound not by blood or law, but by code. Cowboys who answered to justice when justice had no name. The first of them crested the ridge, a tall rider with a red bandana across his face and a rifle slung across his chest. He nodded once toward the lone cowboy, no words needed. Behind him, the others fanned out, forming a semicircle that boxed the outlaws in. Dust turned the air gold, the heat shimmered, and for the first time, the killers looked small. The scarred man barked, "You think we're scared of your little posse?" He lifted his rifle, but before he could aim, the sound of dozens of hammers cocking filled the air. One after another, metal speaking in unison. The cowboy took a single step forward. "You're not outnumbered," he said. "You're out of chances." The leader's smirk faltered. He looked around, the canyon walls, the mission cross, the riders who watched with eyes like judgment itself. He saw no escape. "Drop it," the cowboy said. For a moment, the world stood still. Even the wind waited. Then, with a grunt, the scarred man let his rifle fall to the dirt. The others followed, hands trembling. The lead rider of the group dismounted, walking slowly toward the cowboy. Dust swirled between them like smoke. "Heard the signal," he said, voice rough but steady. "Didn't figure it'd be you calling for it." The cowboy gave a half smile. "Didn't figure I'd ever need to." The other man nodded once. "You done right, brother." He turned his gaze toward the woman behind the wall. "We'll see she gets to safety." The cowboy holstered his weapon, chest rising and falling with the fading adrenaline. Around them the air was heavy with the scent of sweat, gun oil, and redemption. The outlaws stood silent, stripped of arrogance and noise. The woman stepped out from the shade, clutching the Bible tight. When her eyes met the cowboy's, there was something in them that hadn't been there before. Peace. The cowboy tipped his hat slightly, a gesture of promise and farewell. The other riders began to move, circling the captives, their horses snorting and stamping like thunder restrained. For the first time in years, he wasn't alone. The desert had gone quiet again, but it was not peace. It was the silence that comes when justice is still deciding whether to draw its last breath. The outlaws knelt in the dirt, their rifles tossed aside, sweat mixing with dust on their faces. The woman stood by the crumbling wall of the mission, holding the Bible against her chest, as if it were the last warm thing left in the world. The cowboys surrounded them in a loose circle, horses breathing heavy, nostrils flaring from the long ride. The wind pulled at their coats, lifted dust off their hats, and carried it away toward the dying horizon. Among them were men of every kind, farm hands turned riders, drifters who'd seen too much wrong, brothers who'd buried brothers in shallow graves. They didn't speak much, their silence said enough. The single cowboy dismounted slowly, boots touching the ground with a quiet thud. His horse lowered its head, exhausted. He brushed the animal's neck once before stepping forward. His eyes scanned the men before him, their hands trembling, their lips dry, their souls cornered. The leader of the outlaws, the scarred man, lifted his chin with a trace of defiance. "You think this ends with me?" he spat. "There's more coming. You don't know who we ride for." The cowboy stared at him for a long time, then knelt to his level. "Maybe not," he said softly, "but I know what you did." The scarred man's eyes flicked toward the woman. She flinched, her fingers gripping the Bible tighter. The cowboy noticed the look, the guilt that flared and died in the man's eyes like lightning on the horizon. "She ain't worth dying for," the outlaw muttered. The cowboy's jaw tightened. "Everyone's worth dying for, if it means doing what's right." A ripple of agreement moved through the circle of riders. One of them, a grizzled old man with silver in his beard, spoke from his saddle. "We could turn 'em in. Sheriff in Dry Creek'll hang 'em before sundown." Another cowboy shook his head. "Dry Creek's law belongs to men like them." The wind carried their words off into the desert. The single cowboy stood, eyes tracing the horizon. The sun was lowering now, dragging its blood-red edge across the canyon rim. Shadows stretched long across the sand. It would be dark soon. He knew that darkness well, knew the kind of men who used it to crawl back out of hell. He turned to the others. "We make camp here till dawn," he said. "We'll ride at first light. Santa Rosa's 2 days north." The men nodded. They began to move with quiet precision, tying the outlaws' hands, tending the horses, setting up small fires that cast trembling light against the broken walls of the mission. The smell of coffee soon drifted into the air, mixing with sweat, leather, and dust. The cowboy walked toward the woman. She was sitting on a fallen beam, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the light was dying. "You should rest," he said gently. She shook her head. "I can't. Not till I know they won't come back." He looked at her ankle. It was swollen and bruised. He knelt, wrapped it with a strip of cloth from his saddlebag. "They won't," he said, though his voice carried a weight that betrayed him. She studied him, her eyes softening. "You ride alone," she said. "Why?" He didn't answer right away. The firelight flickered across his face, catching the scars time had written there. "Because the road's easier when you've got no one left to lose." Her gaze lingered on him, and she whispered, "Then why did you save me?" He looked at her, the flames reflected in his eyes. "Maybe because I lost someone once who looked at me the same way." The night deepened around them, stars appearing one by one like ghosts of old promises. In the distance, a coyote howled, low and mournful. The riders kept watch in shifts, their silhouettes dark against the firelight, but the cowboy didn't sleep. He stood near the edge of the canyon, listening to the wind crawl through the rocks. His hand rested on the revolver at his hip, and his thoughts wandered where he didn't want them to go, back to the woman in the blue ribbon, the one who had disappeared years ago near this very stretch of land. When he finally turned back toward the camp, the woman's face caught the firelight just right, and for a split second, he saw it again. That same blue ribbon tied in her hair, the one he'd buried in memory, the one he'd thought lost forever. His chest tightened. The past hadn't just returned. It was sitting by his fire, breathing his air, holding his Bible. And somewhere in the darkness, beyond the reach of the flames, another set of eyes was watching. The desert didn't sleep that night. It just waited. A single sound broke the stillness, the crack of a rifle echoing through the canyon. The bullet struck the wall near the woman's head, scattering dust across her face. She gasped, dropping the Bible. The cowboys moved instantly, instincts born from years of gunfire and betrayal. The single cowboy dove for cover behind a fallen beam, revolver drawn. The attackers came out of the dark like shadows made of noise, 6 men on horseback, rifles flashing under the moon. The scarred outlaw had warned them. "You don't know who we ride for." Now the truth came charging over the ridge. "Get her down!" the cowboy shouted. One of his brothers in arms pulled the woman behind the wall, while the others spread out, forming a half circle around the fire. Bullets hissed and cracked, sparking against stone. The smell of gunpowder filled the air, sharp, dry, metallic. The cowboy steadied his breathing, counting the flashes in the dark. 6, maybe 7. He waited for one more flash, then fired once. A distant scream cut through the night. One down. A second attacker rushed the camp, screaming curses, revolver wild. The cowboy rolled, fired again. The man fell forward, his hat spinning into the dust. Silence tried to return, but silence never lasts long in the desert. The scarred prisoner tried to crawl away in the confusion. The cowboy saw it. "Don't even think about it," he said coldly, aiming without hesitation. The outlaw froze, raising his hands. "They'll kill you all!" he spat. "Then we'll die doing what's right," the cowboy said. The leader of the riders, red bandana over his face, signaled with his hand. The group shifted, surrounding the enemy flank. In one motion, all their rifles lifted. The thunder that followed swallowed the canyon whole. The air glowed orange with muzzle fire. Horses screamed. The ground shook. And then it was over. The last shot faded into a long, dry silence. The smoke drifted upward, curling into the stars like prayers that didn't know where to land. When the dust settled, the woman crawled out from behind the wall. Her dress was torn, her face streaked with dirt and tears, but she was alive. She looked around. The attackers lay still, their rifles scattered in the sand. The cowboys stood like statues, breathing heavy but unbroken. She turned to the one who had saved her, voice trembling. "Why did you stay?" He holstered his revolver. "Because running don't change what's wrong. Standing does." The leader of the riders approached, rifle still smoking. "You all right, brother?" The cowboy nodded once. "For now." He looked toward the horizon, where dawn was just beginning to bleed into the sky. "They came for her, they'll come again." The woman clutched the Bible, noticing the bullet lodged in its cover, a hole clean through the middle. "It saved me," she whispered. He looked at it, then at her. "No," he said softly. "Faith did." Around them, the riders began gathering weapons, checking the fallen. The air smelled of ash and iron. A cold wind came down from the ridge, carrying the scent of rain that would never fall. The cowboy turned toward the woman one last time. "When the sun rises, we ride north. Santa Rosa. There's safety there." She nodded, but her eyes lingered on him. You remind me of someone," she said quietly. "My brother, Samuel Boone." The cowboy froze. That name hit him like a blade between the ribs. He looked at her, and the truth dawned slow and heavy. "I knew him," he said finally. "He saved my life once." Her voice cracked. "Then you know why they killed him." He nodded, eyes dark with something old and burning. "I do, and I ain't letting them finish what they started." He turned to the horizon, where the first light touched the ruins, holstered his gun, and whispered to the dawn, "Justice rides at sunrise." Dawn bled slowly across the desert, turning the battlefield into gold. The smoke had settled, and the silence that followed carried the weight of what had been done. The ground was littered with the proof of it, spent shells, footprints, and the dark stains that never truly fade. The cowboy stood near the ruined mission, revolver holstered, hat tipped low. Around him the riders moved like ghosts, gathering the fallen, binding the surviving outlaws who still breathed. None spoke. They didn't have to. The desert had already written its own eulogy. The woman sat near the fire, the first light touching her face. She looked small, fragile, but there was something unbroken in her now. The fear that had once lived in her eyes was gone, replaced by gratitude and something deeper. She watched the cowboy for a long time before speaking. "You could have left," she said softly. He didn't turn. "Could have," he agreed. "Didn't. Why?" He paused. The wind carried the scent of sage and gunpowder, brushing his coat as if to remind him that he was still here. "Because your brother once saved my life in a mining town called Perdido, stood in front of a bullet meant for me, never asked for thanks, never looked back. I owed him." She rose slowly, walking to him, the Bible still clutched against her chest. "And now?" He met her gaze for the first time in the light. "Now, I reckon the debt's paid." Her eyes softened, but there was sadness there too. "They'll come again, won't they?" He looked toward the horizon, where the sun was climbing, fierce and red. "Men like that always do, but not today." The riders finished their work. They gathered in a loose circle, faces solemn. The leader with the red bandana rode forward. "What's next?" he asked. The cowboy turned to the woman. "She rides north, to Santa Rosa. There's a church there, Father Morales. He'll see her safe." The leader nodded. "And you?" The cowboy's eyes drifted toward the canyon, where shadows still clung to the walls, like secrets that refused to die. "I'll make sure no one follows." A murmur ran through the men. They knew what that meant. The cowboy didn't belong to the world of peace anymore. He was the part of justice that walks away when the dust settles. The woman stepped closer. "You could come with us." He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carries both apology and blessing. "I've been trying to find a place to belong my whole life. Turns out it ain't on any map." She reached out, fingers brushing his sleeve. "Then promise me one thing. Don't die out here alone." He looked at her hand, then at her eyes. "Ain't no man alone when he's still got something worth fighting for." A long silence passed between them. The riders began to mount up, their horses shifting in the morning light. The woman climbed into her saddle, wincing at the pain in her ankle. The cowboy helped her steady herself, then stepped back. As she prepared to leave, she held up the Bible. "This was your brother's once," she said, "but I think it belongs to you now." He shook his head. "Keep it. You'll need it more than I will." Her lips trembled, but she nodded. "Goodbye." He tipped his hat. "Ride safe, ma'am." The riders began their slow procession north, the woman at the center of the column. Dust rose behind them like a soft curtain, catching the sunlight in fading gold. The cowboy watched until they became only silhouettes against the horizon, then turned back toward the canyon. The wind picked up again, whispering through the ruins. Somewhere far below, the echo of the gunfight still lingered, a memory carved into the stone. The cowboy adjusted his hat, tightened the strap on his saddle, and looked to the road that stretched endlessly west. He mounted his horse, speaking softly to her. "Come on, girl. We ain't done yet." As he rode away, the sun broke fully over the ridge, bathing him in fire and light. His shadow stretched long across the desert, the mark of a man who carried no name, no home, only a promise kept. And somewhere in that silence, carried on the wind, came the faint toll of a mission bell, one last sound to remind the desert that justice had for once been delivered. By the time the sun reached its height, the desert had swallowed all signs of battle. Only a few blackened shells and broken stirrups glimmered in the sand like small pieces of memory. The single cowboy rode alone once more, his shadow stretching long behind him, the horizon ahead endless and burning. Every hoofbeat echoed through the canyon like a heartbeat that refused to quit. The trail wound along the cliffs, past the river that glimmered like glass, past the scattered bones of wagon wheels long forgotten. The world felt ancient, vast and empty, and yet somehow alive, as if it had been waiting for this one man to pass again. He didn't speak. Men like him rarely did. But in the silence, thoughts came uninvited. Faces too. Samuel Boone's laughter under a desert moon, the woman's trembling voice whispering goodbye, the red bandana rider's solemn nod. Ghosts of the living, all walking beside him. He reached a small rise where the wind carried the scent of rain that would never fall. There he stopped. From that height he could see the wide plain stretching north, the direction she'd gone. A thin line of dust still hung faintly in the air, the mark of her passage. He smiled just barely. "She made it," he murmured. The horse flicked its ears at his voice. He reached down, patting her neck. "We did good, girl." Below, in the canyon, the wind shifted, and the sound that rose from the stones could almost have been a song. Maybe it was just the desert breathing, but to a man like him, it sounded like something truer, like forgiveness. He sat there a long time, hat low, letting the wind tug at his coat and the sunlight bake the dust into his boots. He thought of how many men had come before him, guns at their sides, hearts full of sin and pride, all thinking they could outride their past. None ever did. But maybe, he thought, redemption isn't about outrunning. It's about stopping long enough to face what chases you. Far off, a rider appeared on the horizon, just a speck at first, moving fast. The cowboy's hand drifted toward his revolver, habit before thought. But as the rider drew closer, he saw the truth. It wasn't danger. It was a boy, no older than 16, wearing a coat too big for him and a hat that didn't yet fit. The boy reined up a few yards away, dust swirling between them. "You him?" he asked, voice cracking a little. The cowboy studied him. "Depends who's asking." "They said you were the one who stood your ground at the old mission," the boy said, eyes wide. "They're telling it all over Santa Rosa. Said a lone rider saved a woman from a gang, took down 6 men by moonlight, then vanished with the dawn." The cowboy smiled faintly, shaking his head. "People got a way of stretching stories to fit their hope." The boy shrugged. "Hope's still hope, sir. Father Morales says it don't matter if it's true, so long as it reminds folks that good men still ride." The words landed softly but deep. The cowboy looked out over the plain again, the heat rising in waves. Maybe that was enough, just to leave behind a story that made people believe in something better than fear. He turned back to the boy. "Head home," he said quietly. "Ain't nothing out here worth finding twice." The boy nodded, touching the brim of his hat before riding off, his figure fading into the haze. The cowboy watched until he disappeared, then exhaled slowly. He turned his horse west. The horizon glowed copper under the setting sun, and the wind carried his name into legend, not one anyone would write down, but the kind that lingers in saloon whispers and campfire smoke. They'd call him the single cowboy for years after. Some would swear he still rode under the same moon, watching the roads that led the lost home. Others would say he'd vanished into the canyon, where the wind sounds like prayers and the stars remember faces. But those who knew better, Those who'd seen the way he stood against darkness, they'd simply nod and say, "He didn't die, he just rode on." The sun was sinking low, bleeding into the horizon like the last ember of a dying fire. The desert, vast and eternal, glowed in shades of copper and gold, and every shadow stretched long, like the memory of something that refused to be forgotten. The cowboy rode slow now, his horse tired but steady, hooves soft against the cooling earth. Somewhere behind him justice had been done. Somewhere ahead silence waited, wide and patient. He didn't look back. Men like him never did. But if he had, he might have seen what the desert saw, a figure fading into light, not darkness. The kind of man who'd walked through hell and come out carrying a little piece of heaven in his heart. The kind of man who'd never called himself a hero, but whose story would live where words are whispered softer, around campfires, in the prayers of those who still believe in right and wrong. The wind rose, carrying the faint sound of a mission bell from far away. Maybe it was real, maybe it was memory. Either way, it found him, and he smiled beneath the shadow of his hat. "Guess that's for us," he muttered. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small, a single blue ribbon, frayed at the ends. The woman's ribbon. He held it for a moment, the wind tugging at it gently, then tied it to the saddle horn. It fluttered there, a symbol of what had been saved, what had been lost, and what would never be forgotten. He spoke softly, not to the horse, not to the sky, but to whatever part of the world still listened. "Ain't about killin' or winnin'," he said. "It's about knowing when to stand and who to stand for." The horse snorted as if agreeing, and together they rode toward the dying sun. The desert opened before them, endless, merciless, and yet somehow holy. The cowboy knew he'd never escape it. The desert was part of him now, stitched into his bones, his blood, his breath. But maybe that was all right. Maybe the West didn't need saving. It just needed men willing to carry its stories. Far behind him, in the town of Santa Rosa, the woman would arrive safely. She'd tell her tale to Father Morales, and he'd write it down so people would remember the truth, that courage isn't loud, and faith doesn't always wear a halo. Sometimes it wears dust, leather, and a shadow that rides alone. And somewhere, around a campfire or in a quiet chapel, a stranger would tell that same story to someone else. They'd say there was once a cowboy who found a woman hanging off the edge of a cliff, and when he pulled her up, he found redemption waiting in her eyes. Maybe that's how legends are born, not from fame, but from the echo of one good act done when no one's watching. The cowboy's silhouette shrank against the orange horizon until it became nothing but a moving speck swallowed by light. The ribbon fluttered behind him, catching the wind, catching the sun. If you've ridden this far, if you've felt the dust, the silence and the heartbeat of this land, then you already know the truth the cowboy carried, that even in a world carved by violence, mercy still rides beside us, quiet and steady. Before this story disappears into the sunset, take a moment, leave your mark on the trail. Tell us in the comments, what did this journey make you feel? What would you have done if you were there on that cliff, and if you believe that justice still has a place in this world, that good men still stand when others fall? Then saddle up with us. Subscribe, share this story, and keep the fire burning, because every legend needs someone to remember it. The cowboy fades into gold. The bell tolls one last time, and the desert keeps his secret.